Welcome to NucleCast, the official podcast of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Each week, we bring you leading experts for a lively discussion on topics related to strategic nuclear deterrence. Our host is Dr. Adam Lowther, Director of Strategic Programs at the National Strategic Research Institute. The views of the hosts and the guests are their own.
Welcome back to another great episode of NucleCast. Of course, I am your host, Adam Lowther, and today we have a very special guest, different than I can't even say different than our normal guests because we've been going pretty far afield lately. So today we have Major General retired Brad Gericke. In his last job, he was the Army's G-35, but I met him. And we were talking nukes because he was one of the few folks in the Army who understood just how important nuclear weapons were to the Army and to the potential conflicts that the service may fight in the future. Let me also add that Brad is not only Major General, but at the end of his name, he puts PhD because he's also one of the brightest officers the Army had. So with that, General Gericke, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Adam. Overly kind and generous as usual, but pleasure, an absolute pleasure to be here with you this morning.
So the reason that, I always enjoyed working with you is because, you obviously knew how important nuclear weapons were to the future fight. And it was something that, by and large, the Army, as the service that didn't have nuclear weapons, didn't really think much about. But it, of course, is a service that has a very strong tradition of, the Manhattan Project was an Army project. Much of the Cold War, the Army had, a substantial arsenal and an arsenal that was the most likely to get used in actual conflict. And then the Cold War came. The Army got rid of all of its nukes and said, geez, we get to go back to the kind of fights we like. But we now face an adversary in the Russians and then potentially the Chinese, where the Army is not going to be able to say, we're just going to fight our preferred conventional fight. How do you see the Army interacting or playing a major role on a battlefield where nuclear weapons are involved? What does that look like? What does the Army need to be thinking about?
Yeah, Adam. So I've worked through a logic that I am afraid that our adversaries may be adopting something similar. And that's the concern that drives me to promote in the Army more awareness to ultimately lead to readiness. And my logic kind of goes like this. In May of 1945, the Allies encircled Berlin, and then the Soviets eliminated the Nazi regime door by door, room by room, in the conventional way. And that is the way wars, if you wanted to compel an adversary, you literally dug him out of the ground and eliminated resistance at the point of the bayonet. Very traditional. And then you go forward in that same summer of 1945 to August, and the Allied forces in the Pacific were facing a similar end of the war. They settled on a casualty estimate on the Allied side of something like 1 million, and then there would be several million Japanese civilian and military casualties. And by every standard measure, the Japanese armed forces were defeated, except the Japanese were not willing to admit that. They were not compelled. And so the Allies employed a nuclear weapon. And the effect of that was to bring the casualty figures on the Allied side from 1 million right down to essentially zero. And it, as terrible as it was, and this is not an advocacy for the use of nuclear weapons, but in the cold logic of how do you win a war, it was you even killed fewer Japanese than would otherwise have occurred. Now, we could wish that we were in a world in which nuclear weapons didn't exist. And they are extraordinarily powerful, especially at the higher yields, and they can destroy societies in their entirety. But if you break it down into a lower yield, a battlefield type of a weapon, that could be used along with conventional maneuver, then you begin to see a tool that I'm afraid is going to look very interesting to our adversaries. And that became evident in August of 1945, that there's a way to escalate. There's a way to go high, to go quick, and to achieve battlefield effects. Now, there's two outcomes of August 1945. One is that it's hard to imagine compelling a nuclear armed state short of the use of a nuclear weapon. But also in a regional sense, I think we live now in an era of what I call limited total war, in which nuclear states will not want to fight over existential questions, and they will have their contests over regional, if you will, or sub-state contests. So Ukraine is an example, potentially Taiwan is an example, South China Sea. I mean, there are places where great powers are exerting their influence that could come to a kinetic solution, in which a battlefield 10 kiloton, 7 kiloton, 5 kiloton weapon becomes a compelling, an attractive option for an adversary. And I feel like that's the world that we live in, and that our adversaries eventually will take that quick solution, climb the escalation ladder, and put us at a disadvantage.
Yeah, you bring up a great point, and I'll have to be honest, I spent most of my career as a Department of the Air Force civil servant. So I thought primarily about strategic nuclear conflict. And then when I came to SAMS and had to transition from being an Air Force guy to an Army guy, and I started thinking, I went to TNOC out at Defense Nuclear Weapons School and really focused on the employment of weapons. What are your minimum safe distances? Where can troops be employed? And once you do that and you start doing the calculations and you run the data and you see just how usable low and ultra low yield weapons actually are, and then you see, well, if I make this an air burst and I put it at a fallout free height of burst, I can still destroy, hardened concrete facilities. I can do a lot of stuff with these lower yield weapons that make them effective without creating these heavily irradiated zones that we traditionally think of. And this is something that I don't think many Americans think about, but it's probably something, as you clearly pointed out, that the Army definitely needs to think about, because they very well may fight on that battlefield, but potentially in NATO somewhere. Do you think that the Army has been giving sufficient thought to this? Are you sort of, in your time on the staff at the Pentagon, were you sort of leading the charge, or is USANCA sort of this small repository of, Yodas? I mean, where are we in terms of thinking about it?
We're moving in the right direction. We're not moving with the urgency that I believe is necessary to get ready for this threat. The enemy, I believe, has a tool as you described it. And while we all worry and are even fearful of a global intercontinental exchange of missiles, that I believe is not the immediate threat. I believe the threat is a battlefield theater employment of this class of weapons, because you can restore, in fact, maneuver after the use of this kind of a weapon. You can seal off a flank, right? There are ways in which, airbursts, as you mentioned, in which you can free up maneuver space to allow your forces to gain ground or seize an objective in ways that are just too difficult to attrit by conventional means. So it allows you to mass, is what it allows you to do, to free up maneuver space. And I believe this will be appealing to an adversary who doesn't want a long, drawn-out contest. It's amazing that in Ukraine, it looked, even with all the UASs and all the latest sensors and the communications technology, it looks like World War I. It looks exactly like World War I. Why is that? Because both sides there have lost the ability to maneuver, which was the problem from 1914 to 1917. So we have the same problem in Ukraine. So if you want to avoid that morass, a battlefield employment of a nuclear weapon, I believe, is attractive. In the Army and in all the services, We exaggerate the death and destruction and harm, and thus we minimize in our minds the likelihood of its employment. And that allows us to keep that skeleton in the closet, as it were, to avoid the conversation. Senior leaders confront me with the response is something along the lines of, "Well, if we go to nuclear weapons, that's another whole thing. So let's not invest in trying to be ready for that." Or that's somebody else's problem because the Army is a non-nuclear armed force, and that belongs to Stratcom, or that belongs to the Air Force, or that belongs to the Navy. As the land force, who has to operate on a battlefield that could be contaminated, in which an adversary is seeking to exploit the effects of a nuclear strike or a limited, atomic mine or that kind of thing, I think it is absolutely in the Army's business in terms of medical care, evacuation, and then the restoration of maneuver. And so the Army has a huge role to play. And the secular arguments, as we make this case with USANCO, with experts such as yourself and your organization, I've not ever heard a logical counter argument that people make to say, "Hey, this is no threat at all." But they don't feel the urgency. They're not theological about it. They're not passionate about it to make the investments to begin to ready the force in the ways that I believe are necessary.
Yeah, and my fear is that by virtue of sort of this, head in the sand approach, that if, these are not the droids you're looking for kind of approach, that we make it only more likely, because we make it more attractive to the Russians to say, hey, listen, the Americans, they really don't have the capability. They can't match us. They can't out escalate us, on a battlefield. And then the other argument I hear is, well, what we're going to do is we're going to build really excellent, conventional strike, precision strike. That ways we can do the same thing, but with conventional weapons. And it seems to be completely ignorant of the fact that the Russians and the Chinese see those exquisite conventional capabilities as far more likely to be used, and so therefore are far more dangerous and frightening to them. Whereas nuclear weapons, they sort of understand those things are held in reserve. And I don't know how to convince folks that they're actually playing a very dangerous game.
Right. So my professional advice has always been, the more ready the Army is across the spectrum of conflict, especially here at the high operational end, the more ready we are, the more options I provide to policymakers, and the more space I can create for them that hopefully they can avoid. I mean, the goal here is to win the military competition, deter the adversary, and not come to this. And I believe the best way to do that is readiness. And the Army, of course, we don't have in this current age, and I'm not promoting or advocating that the Army return to the Cold War period when we had our own nuclear weapons. I believe the Joint Force should have them at scale. But the Army can still contribute to readiness, and must contribute to readiness through resiliency, through the ability to operate in this environment, through the ability to evacuate casualties, to enable joint force maneuver, and then to use our conventional strike, which I agree. I think conventional strike, we have not thought through, and this is starting to get into a little bit of a different subject, but we have not thought through the implications of long-range conventional strike, hypersonics, and those classes of weapons, and how they may look to an adversary, and what kinds of targets do we really think are going to be most susceptible to that kind of weaponry. So there are interconnected pieces here in terms of our offensive capabilities that we have not thought through either, and we lack an operational analysis, really, I think, of how you have to win at the campaign echelon.
Well, let me push back on you. So we're going to take a quick break. And when we take our break, I want to give you a chance to think about this. So my premise is, I was doing some research on INF and was at the Reagan Library and just going through all of the debates in the White House. And Reagan, he wanted to eliminate these intermediate, medium, short-range weapons. And so he built up to force the Soviets to then back down and give up. And, you had Glickman and, Pershing too, which scared the hell out of the Soviets. And I wonder if it's not time for the Army to be a nuclear force again with, Glickman was an Air Force weapon, Pershing was an Army weapon. Maybe it's time for Pershing 3 in Europe and Asia. And then from that, you then have a position where you could potentially, renegotiate with the Russians or the Chinese on these weapons or improve deterrence. And I also wonder that if the Army had the weapons, it would therefore be forced to think about nuclear warfighting and think about just exactly what this means. So we'll take a quick break. We're talking to Major General retired Brad Gericke, and we'll be right back. This episode of NucleCast is brought to you by the AMLA Deterrence Center, whose mission is to educate Americans about the nuclear enterprise and strategic deterrence. You're listening to NucleCast, and we're back. And right just before the break, I gave General Gericke a pretty challenging question, I think. But now that we're back, it's his turn to tell me why I'm wrong, or agree, or take a different approach.
Yeah, I will in return, I'll reply with two pushbacks to you. And not that I'm sympathetic and believe that should be examined, because I do. But here's the institutional reasons I have not to date made the argument that you're proposing. The first is that the Army has a lot of work to do to understand nuclear weapons. So there's our nuclear IQ, our cultural awareness, our institutional adaptations that are necessary in the training and the manning realm, not to mention the equipping and hardening realms, are so inadequate that that is where I think that's where I've always tried to focus Army leaders. It's also the things that we've been proposing at USANCA and at the G35 while it's on active duty don't cost a lot of money. So there are choices that senior leaders could make today to start improving readiness. A year from now, if they did these things a year from now, 2 years from now, we would be in much better shape, and the costs are minimal. When you start talking about acquiring weapons of an entirely new class, then you get into expenses, not just money, but manning and organizational design. So as is well known, the Army is having some challenges recruiting. So if we're an Army in the vicinity of 450,000 troops, and there's a lot of demands on the force for new types of skills. We just had a brief mention here of long range strike. So long range strike, those batteries are not the same as a TOAD 105. So you're going to have all new types of mechanics, all new types of support systems, all new types of chains of command, new sensors, right? New command and control. We've got cyber. We've got linkages with space, unmanned aerial systems. Though we probably need more of those. So there's a range of specialties that the Army requires at a time in which the end strength is shrinking. And there is pressure already. How much can I take away from my basic combat arms or my extant functional areas to give to these new capabilities and these new functions? So there's real personnel pressure inside the Army to figure out what is the optimal design for future war. And I'm afraid that if we introduced another entire class of weapons, it would just become so difficult that the Army we would study it forever and not get there. So my approach has been the two-step. Let's get ready to operate. Let's be able to medically evacuate. Let's improve resiliency. Let's improve training. And then we can have a conversation with the joint force about the distribution of these weapons across the services.
Yeah, that's a good point. Let me ask you, as you think about the fight in the Pacific, and this is one where I think the Army's probably without question more impacted than any other service. As sort of the Russian invasion of Ukraine was almost a gift to the Army that would sort of keep us from shifting to Asia more. And that fight in Asia, which I think many folks seem as somewhat inevitable, which hopefully not, but it's the prevailing view, is one in which it seems the Army will do a lot of air defense, will try to provide long range fires, but some of the larger components of some of the larger combat arms of the Army, I'm not sure have a major role in the Asia Pacific. How do you see that potential fight shaping, influencing the Army and what it does and doesn't do?
I think that the conflict in the Pacific, I think the threat of conflict in the Pacific is certainly rising. And I believe the Army is going to play a decisive role. Now, the Army has kind of settled upon a formula similar to what you're describing, where we're going to enable joint maneuver and joint operations. I see it as far more decisive. And I think our history, the Army has more campaign streamers in the Asia Pacific than any other theater than North America. And we have been in the Pacific, right, since the Boxer Rebellion, the Philippine insurrection, World War II, Vietnam, Korea, and we're there today. So for a region of the world that's vast, of course, in which we say there's not going to be a lot of ground fighting, there sure have been a lot of ground forces assigned and in combat in that part of the world. And so when you start thinking about interior lines, was the idea that General Flynn at USAPAC has out there to complicate adversary decision making through positioning strike around the region to the south and to the west, and as well as to the northeast with our treaty allies in Korea and Japan. You think about the Korean Peninsula. You think about all the sensors that have to be protected. You think about the other critical assets with our allies that have to be defended. It ends up looking like a lot of ground forces are in play and will be struck and will be asked to strike back. And at the end of the day, again, go back to 1945, if you want to compel an adversary, whether that's a regional objective or that is a state objective, you're going to have to put boots on the ground. And I will tell you, being the senior planner in the Joint Force as well as in the Army, our plans typically end with boots on the ground. And that's because that's the only way you can guarantee success. So I think we undersell the role of land power in the Pacific and because of the way the department is structured. And I believe the Army has a tremendous role to play, and the opportunity for the employment of nuclear weapons there, at altitude, off axis, if you will, S-pod, A-pod, beaches. I mean, there's just atolls. There is a variety of targets. Some of them are not highly populated, which in fact makes them, I think, a little more desirable. Mm-hmm. And so I think the opportunity for land power in the Pacific, and General Flynn is working, giving training guidance. I think he's leading the Army and the Joint Force in many ways to ready the force out there, more medical training, more war games about evacuation of contaminated, wounded, and remains. So there's a lot going on in the training realm. We're starting to go on in the training realm out there. And Europe is doing it as well. But in the Pacific, I think land war in the Pacific is land war. And I think war in the Pacific has a significant threat of a nuclear escalation at the battlefield campaign echelon.
Do you think we have the capabilities to move soldiers around the Pacific to fight? Because you do make a good point that there's a lot of land mass, and choking off the Chinese by making it virtually impossible to move through straits and narrows and things of that nature, that's seems highly desirable and certainly something the Army would be good at. Do you think we can move folks?
I think that is a huge challenge. I think you have to orient the posture of the force and orient the force now to win the first battle. I think if you don't win the first battle, then you fight a long war, which is worse. So is it expensive? to move forces, to posture forces today in ways that are acceptable to our allies and partners around the region, it is expensive. It is fraught with some assumptions about access in times of crisis and conflict. To me, those are risks that are well worth investing in and underwriting, because if we're out of position for the first battle, then it becomes prohibitive to win. And that's what, if you look at the few times we've lost a campaign, the Army has not lost many. We lose battles sometimes, we don't lose campaigns. 1942 in the Pacific was one where we lost the campaign. We didn't have strike. We had isolated forces, insufficient forces, and we had to fight our way all the way back to get to Japan in 1945. We don't want to be in a position like that today. So moving our forces, long range strike, putting them in the right places, putting in forward stockages of different classes of supply that are acceptable to our allies and partners is the way, again, I believe, to ready ourselves for the first fight. And again, I think our adversary realizes the time distance factors also. And so a nuclear strike at the battlefield echelon becomes more attractive because they can punch hard and early and leave us with a fait accompli. If they go high up the escalation ladder, and they do that, 5 kiloton strike on an S-pod or an A-pod, then what is our counter move? Do we go for a 2-year war? Is that really what we want to sign up for? So it becomes very difficult if you concede that space to the adversary and can't strike back with any kind of either long-range strike because you're out of position or you don't have the fighter range. It takes time to get the naval task forces in place and all that. You got to have those postured forward, I believe, to deny the adversary that first battle advantage.
So if I were to, as I have become, it's my normal custom these days, is to share my genie with the guests on the show and let them make 3 wishes. And of course, I'm curious what your 3 wishes might be.
My first wish is for globally integrated plans. And people who know me are laughing about that because that was my thing back in the day. And under Chairman Dunford and General McKenzie and General Clark, we had a period for about a year and a half or 2 years in which we were building global plans against chief adversaries. So the Department of Defense is regionally organized. The Secretary of Defense and the President has a commander in each region of the world that they give orders to and consult with about the threat in that region. And everybody wants to integrate. Everybody understands philosophically the need to integrate, but integration at the planning echelon to date is immature and insufficient. We have combatant commands and services that have symbiotic relationships with each other. The plans support the budget and the service budget supports the plan, and everybody's generally satisfied with that. It just means, though, that warfighting is difficult, and preparing to actually warfight is problematic. So wish number 1, we need genuine globally integrated war plans from conception, and even with allies and partners, frankly, they should be involved in the planning process. And that's doable. It doesn't cost a thing. 1 year from today, we could have global plans for the main adversaries, and they would be sufficient to get us started. It's not that hard to do, but the status quo just continues to push us back on that. The second thing I would ask the Army to get busy on training, and I would get busy on every CTC rotation should have a nuke chem component to it. We should have a series of war games. We should conduct an operational gaps analysis that tells us what do I need to maneuver at the operational echelon and fight with UAS, long range strike, the threat of nuclear contamination, as well as a limited chemical strike, et cetera. Those gaps, we would find new gaps that we're not tracking right now in our modernization program, which I believe is overly tactical and system specific, and it's not sufficiently integrated. So that's how I would like to see that happen. And then I just want to raise our nuclear IQ. I've been in war games, high-level war games, 4-star sponsored war games, in which participants cried. I have never in my life seen someone cry until in recent years because of the employment of nuclear weapons. That is how fraught socially, morally, right? Just the shock of it that nuclear weapons are inside of our defense institutions. So we've got a lot of education to do to help people understand what is possible, what is the risk, and what are the capabilities we could develop to mitigate those. So nuclear IQ would be my battlefield. Nuclear IQ would be my third wish. And thanks, Mr. Genie. I appreciate that. I look forward to seeing that happen.
Yeah. Well, thanks for, I mean, those are actually 3 great wishes, and it's all wishes that I think many of the listeners would say, yeah, right on. So some good wishes. Now, if you were to leave the listeners with sort of the takeaway to remember 6 months from now about the Army and nuclear, what would that takeaway be?
Do not underestimate the resolve and the creativity of our adversaries. We, are generally a peace-loving people, and we don't want war, but we are a great, long-standing status quo power, and others are not. And others who seek to achieve the status and the influence we have will be willing to do things that we believe are certainly undesirable or even unthinkable. And so if we continue to underestimate and not to prepare, then we get the worst outcome. The outcome we don't want is the one that happens. I believe it is a high probability that an adversary will use a battlefield nuclear weapon in my lifetime, certainly in the lifetime of a new lieutenant who's coming under the force. I tell people to write it down. It's going to happen because the logic is going to drive an adversary to that outcome. And so I would leave the audience with, if think about that, and then think about the measures we can take to improve our capabilities and readiness that ultimately then prove me wrong.
All right. Major General Retired Brad Gericke, thanks for coming on Nuclecast.
Thank you. This is a real pleasure. Thank you for doing this.
Yeah, it was a great show. And thanks to you, the listeners. And we will see you next time on Nuclecast. Okay, so afterthoughts from talking to Brad Gericke. The number one thing that came to mind, deep thinker. He has really thought about these bigger, broader issues and how the Army might have to face a nuclear battlefield. How do we plan? How do we train? Where are we? Where do we need to go? So it was great. And, he happens to be really good as a public speaker. So that was helpful. So it was a great show. I mean, we've never really talked about how the Army would have to fight through nuclear conflict and, just what its role might be in, an Asia Pacific fight. And so it was good to hear that, from General Gericke. And so I don't know about you, but I thought it was a great show.
This has been a production of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Our executive producer is Kimberly Charrington, and this episode has been engineered and mixed by David Krumthal. Follow the show on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at Nuclecast. Listen, follow, and review the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.